Well, in this second session, I would like to introduce the kinds of things we've talked about before, but in a slightly more shaped form as a theoretical frame. So again, the issue is, what is the current landscape of communication? And the frame, the theoretical framing, is that of semiotics, social semiotics, because for me, meaning comes from the social and is socially made, and multimodal, slightly redundant, because, of course, in any one society, meaning is made in very many different ways, with many different modes. The social then as prior and as generative of meaning, and therefore also as generative of representation. And then this issue of how do we think about meaning, and I would like to say meaning is the result of work, of semiotic work, but also of physical work, manual work, all kinds of work. And social and semiotic work produces both cultural resources and meaning. And importantly for me, therefore, if you're thinking about representational change, for instance, what is the communicational landscape in which writing exists, really you need to look at the social. What social change has there been? And what kind of representational semiotic change has it produced? Or is it likely to have produced? Or the other way around, to say, if there is now a very different communicational landscape to the one that was common to those of us who lived 30, 40 years ago, then it is because there has been social change, not because of some other kind of circumstance. And if you want to understand the present or discern the future of meaning, of representation and of design, then I think the first step is to try to discern the future of the social. In what direction is the social moving? And that, I think, will give us a sense of how the communicational landscape and writing within it is moving. Now, I tried to find a Danish equivalent of the German word Umbruch. Does anybody know that word? Umbruch? In my childhood, when farmers ploughed the field with a horse or an oxen and a plough, and they ploughed along, the earth was turned over, sort of glistening. Of course, it happens now with a tractor too. The earth is kind of turned over. What was below is now on the top. It's kind of a real change. It's still the earth, but it's kind of turned over and it's broken. So one of these social aspects of this Umbruch, this profound change, that turning over, is that we have moved from a society and therefore identity shaped by the demands of the state, who said, I'd like to produce citizens and a labor force for this state, to a society and identity shaped by the demands of the market. So the market says, especially the neoliberal capitalist market says, choose. You can choose. The task, the semiotic task, is now to choose, and we define ourselves through consumption, rather than through let's say, the status relations, the role types, the forms of work that we were defining ourselves by beforehand. But of course, choice in consumption applies to choice anywhere. Not just going to the supermarket, or not just going to a big shopping center and kind of seeing which shop shall I go in, which kinds of things will I buy, but it becomes a habit, it becomes a disposition which says I can choose wherever I am. And so young people coming into school come with a disposition towards choice. They will choose, and they will make the selection out of which they will form their identity. That's a very, very different notion to the ideal of the school, which was attempting to do the task of the state. The state has given up, I'm talking about the Anglo-Saxon state in the shape of, let's say, England, not the whole UK. The state has given up that role and handed it to the market. And young people come to school saying, I want to choose. I know what I want. And the school is still lodged in that notion of, but we're the authority, we can tell you what you should do, and we will tell you, and I think you should do what we want you to do. That's, I think, the chasm at the moment. The social is one of intense diversity, of plurality, of fragmentation, of provisionality. The structures in power and authority. Young people challenge the authority of authors in the way that people of my generation didn't. And maybe people of a generation of 40 and beyond still maybe don't. You didn't challenge the authority of the doctor, the medical doctor whom you saw when something was wrong with you. Now, actually, when I go to the general practitioner, last time I went, it was said to me, actually, you've probably looked this up on Wikipedia already, haven't you? But if you haven't, go and look it up on Wikipedia. You do it. I'm actually just a sort of a person sitting here to kind of help you come to some decision. So there's been a weakening of social framing. And of course, a weakening of social framing means also a weakening of all kinds of semiotic framings. For instance, semiotic framings such as what kinds of genres are there, and what are these genres about? What kinds of modes shall we use for doing what kind of representational job? Are there still canonical modes for representing what we regard as knowledge in science, in physics, or in biology, or in literature? So the weakening of social frames is responsible for the weakening of semiotic frames, which is kind of everywhere evident, or at least it seems to be. And I think communication now is what I've called generationally riven, torn, generationally stratified. And for me, generation is like gender is the social specification or conventionalization of sex. Generation is the social conventionalization of age, and it's a real social category. A certain group, maybe above the age of 35, 40, belongs to one kind of semiotic tradition, and the other, below that, and certainly below the age of, say, 25, 20, belongs to different. I was certainly focused on the page. My children are focused very much to the screen. In our house there are shelves and shelves of cookery books, but when our teenagers wanted to make a spaghetti bolognese, they didn't go to the cookery books, they went to the internet. Yeah, that's a very different orientation. From traditional forms of production to digital forms of production, and above all, from linearity, which I would relate to things like hierarchy and clear organization of power, to modularity, which I would relate to a situation in which we have modules which we, according to our interest, shape into things that we want. It's a little bit like the quote somebody, was it you read, about information. It's the stuff out of which I transform knowledge in order to do the job that I want in a particular situation. And so therefore the contemporary landscape is marked by a layered co-presence of communicational forms. It's not that the traditional forms don't exist. It's not that the new forms don't exist. They exist, as it were, layered, nearly geologically layered, but also socially stratified. So in terms of power, it is of course the case that the traditional forms still are the forms you use in particular kind of institutional, political, economic situations. Power belongs to them, and other kinds of power belong to the other forms. So as far as a curriculum for writing and the school is concerned, in my mind, it's absolutely essential to be aware of the layeredness of this, and to say the various layers coexist. They exist in different social domains with different kinds of power attached. And if we have a notion of a democratic community society, then it's the job of the school to make sure that both parts of this geological cake are taught with equal effectiveness. In other words, writing in its traditional form taught better, and writing in its newly developing form taught with as much understanding as we can do. So both together, but with a clear sense of this belongs here, this belongs to this generation and to these social domains, this belongs to those generations and those social domains, socially stratified in terms of power, in terms of functions, in terms of domains, but both needing to be present in the curriculum of the school. Which I think is, for me, one answer to a question about, well, what does the school do in response to that? At the moment, I think, in England, in any case, the school says we want a young generation which is innovative and generative and productive and adapted to change and creative, but we want you to kind of stay rigidly with the traditions which we knew when we were your age. It's not something that's going to work. And in terms of reading, the effect is really, if the authority of the author, as Barthes, of course, Roland Barthes said in 1968 in his essay, The Death of the Author, if the author's authority has gone, is waned, then the authority of the reader is present, and reading is no longer the task of attempting to recover the author's text and meaning in the way the author might have intended it, but reading is now the task of designing what is there in the text in relation to our interests and the needs we have at a particular moment. So if I were to show, this is two examples. The example I use quite often is one of an information book from 1927 for The Boy Electrician, is the name of the title of the book. This was an information book for boys from the age of 7, say, to 11, so that when they made their own little radio sets or a bell for the house, they wouldn't kind of electrocute themselves. This book of 23 chapters was there to help them and not get into trouble or kill themselves. This is very much the traditional form. The author has assembled knowledge, and the author, Mr. Sims, was delegated to kind of assemble, by somebody assemble this, or kind of took it on himself, assemble this in 23 chapters. The 23 chapters have to be read in order, in sequence. You can't kind of go to chapter 21 before you've read chapter, let's say, 17, or the order is given, the order of this unfolds line by line, paragraph by paragraph, and chapter by chapter. The chapter is something which now is beginning to disappear, because the chapter was actually not defined as a semiotic entity but as a conceptual entity. The amount of knowledge that needed to be conveyed was contained in a chapter, and the chapter was as long as the knowledge was big, as it were, to be contained in a chapter. So the chapter harks back to a notion of knowledge, where knowledge defines representation. What defines representation now is something quite different. It's the interest of the reader. The double-page spread is a very different thing to the chapter. The double-page spread says, some publisher and their design team will say, we think, let's say, 10 to 13-year-olds are interested in amphibians. Why don't we design a book that gives them all sorts of stuff about amphibians? And here is one of these from the mid-1990s, a Dorling and Kindersley book about amphibians. This is no longer a linear organization. This is no longer an organization in which a single author says, I've assembled stuff for you, and here it is, but you must follow the line, the ordering in which I've given it to you. But rather this is saying, look, we got together and we've got a lot of stuff here, we've put it on the page, we try to make it look attractive, you make your sense of it according to what you want. Now, somebody of my age might probably go here, it's the biggest bit of writing, it's comfortable, it's comforting, it's kind of something I can hang on to. That's where I start. I think that most children in the mid-90s, and probably now if the book is still around, would not have done that. They would have gone somewhere on this double-page spread where their interest took them. So just this choice in the supermarket takes you where your interest says you should go, the vegetables, the cornflakes, whatever. Here your interest takes you to a particular place, and it's unlikely to be the written part first. It might be. It's much more likely to be the image part first, and then you say, the writing might also give me clues about something which is represented by the image. So now the task of writing is shifted from being center stage to being a kind of a marginal, having a marginal function. It has a role on the side. It says, here for instance, I can't read this, but it says something about what this dorsal kind of, these dorsal spines are about in this amphibian. It gives you information as caption, as small kinds of paragraphs. Are they really paragraphs? Or do paragraphs actually belong to chapters? Are they little blocks of knowledge? Which are distributed around this page in relation to information that you may want to have with images of certain kinds. So some of these are captions, some of these are informationally specific. Here this kind of hip plate has a sort of a label attached to it, and so forth. This is a very different organization. The reason I use this page is because actually this was a book, or is a book. So it's not the screen that has led in this direction, but rather it's a social development that has led in that direction. And the screen, of course, then comes along and says, but we can do this much better. Now we can do this kind of modularization much better. We can kind of assemble stuff much more easily, much more readily. It can be changed from time to time. This is a fundamental change. It's the mid-90s. Dorling and Kindersley, I think, started at the beginning of the 1990s, or maybe the late 80s, when I came across it. But that's very different to Mr. Sims's assumption about what readers should do and how they needed to behave. Linearity and authority, modularity, and a kind of a generalized, horizontally dispersed kind of power to those who come to the book to exercise their interest in the design of this page. It's reading as design. Not reading as the recovery of a pre-given meaning. And here is a website. It's called the Poetry Archive. This was set up about 10 years ago because, like you, I live in the kingdom, and therefore we have a poet laureate who's appointed to write kind of poems for royal events. And that poet laureate set up this archive. This is the page, not the home page, but the page that says about us. And you can see it's kind of, again, comfortingly traditional writing of the kind that we know, linear. Yes, it's got little bits on the side which are a bit different, but actually I can still sort of feel relatively at home. When I go to the children's page of the same website, things look somewhat different. So this is the page for, say, 8 to 11-year-olds, and you can see that its organization is entirely different. Here, I think you can still see that our interests, our interests dominate and organize what is presented. Here, it's not that the children have organized this, but rather assumptions about the reader, as indeed assumptions about the reader here, have organized that page. And the assumption is the interests of these people are very different. The interests of these people are not entirely predictable. We can't order them linearly. There's no point where you necessarily would start. Would you start with an image, or are you attracted by the color, or will you go to the bits of writing that are there? All of these are open questions, but it shows what I mean by this generational gap, this generational layering. This, I think, is normal for an age group. In various, of course, in very different ways for an age group below, let's say, 25 or 20. And I think we need to take account of it. And if we are teachers of writing, we have to ask, in what way is writing present here? Do we have paragraphs here? Do we have anything like a chapter? Are there complex sentences? What kind of lexis? Is there a coherent written text? What function does writing have here? Is it what we comfortably thought was the kind of core, the center of our culture, that defined our culture, or is it something else? And I think it's something quite different. But as I say, it coexists with this. Yeah, it would be wrong to say this is all that exists and this is what we should teach, but rather it coexists. The task now is to persuade people who are used to this as normal to become interested in that. That's worthwhile. That becomes the pedagogic task. And I think that requires a difference on my part in attempting to understand how the interests of people who have been socialized into this could be kind of attracted to that other kind of writing. That's, I think, the pedagogic task. I don't think it's impossible, but it can't proceed as it did before on the basis of authority. I'm the authority. I know it's good. I'm telling you it's good, and you better do it. So writing in a differently configured world. It's not that the cultural technology of writing disappears, but it's that the cultural technology of writing changes fundamentally in its uses, but also in its shape. Yeah, and the next two examples I want to show you come from a research project I did with a colleague, Jeff Bezemer, which I had called Gains and Losses, because, of course, the decline, as it were, or as it seems, in writing has given rise to cultural pessimism. People say, you know, the world as we know it is just going to the dogs. It's from here, it's all downhill. And I thought, it may be that there are some things which are better done by image than by writing. There could be gains as well as losses. Or if there are losses, we should be able to identify what might be lost. And then we should say, we don't want this to be lost. Me, of my generation, feeling a sense of responsibility to my culture, to my society, to young people. So gains and losses, and saying, no, we don't want to lose. In the case that I'm going to show you now, the complex sentence. So here, a page from a science textbook called Magnetism and Electricity, 1936. The book was praised for being richly illustrated and therefore attractive to its readers, who were kind of 12 to 13-year-olds, boys, of course, in grammar school. But here you have a sentence, I'll show it to you in a moment, a long sentence. And then I'll show you a page this is from a chapter. Here we have chapter. There's something about magnetism and electricity, namely magnetism here, that needs to be shown, and the chapter kind of does it. And when everything that needed to be shown is shown, the chapter finishes. This here comes again from a double-page spread. I have to turn the other side. It doesn't have chapters. It's a similar kind of topic, physics, so I've shown it. And in this book, on this page, you have very different kinds of sentences. I'll show you the two sentences, and I'll read them for you because it's probably difficult to read from the back. From the first book, and you can count now how many sub-sentences are there in the sentence, clauses, and I've italicized them. When a current is passed through the coil in the direction indicated in the figure, we can show, by applying Fleming's left-hand rule, that the left-hand side of the coil will tend to move down and the right-hand side to move up. Yeah? 7 sub-sentences in one sentence. That's a complex sentence, I would say. Yeah? And it's mainly embedded. In the book from 1989, you can again count the number of sub-sentences in each sentence. In your first circuits, you use torch bulbs joined with wires. 2. 7 here, 2 there. Modern electrical equipment uses the same basic ideas. 1. But if you look inside a computer, there are not many bulbs or wires. 1. The wires and bulbs have been replaced by electronic devices like transistors, chips and light-emitting diodes. 1. In that book, I haven't completely counted, but all the pages where I looked carefully, there was no sentence which had more than 2 sub-sentences. Yeah? It's a massive reduction in complexity. And of course you can understand, and people will say the complexity is gone. Syntactic complexity points, I think, to conceptual complexity. That's its reason for existing. Conceptual complexity. I want to say something complex about this thing. Conceptual complexity might point to cognitive complexity. Cognitive complexity goes with this, therefore people will become dumb. Yeah, it's the English phrase dumbing down, which is present here. Well, it's in that context of dumbing down that I thought, why don't we look at textbooks? And we looked at textbooks from the 1930s to now in mathematics, in physics, in mathematics, in science, in biology rather, and in English, to see the changes in that and what actually had gone on. Wanting to say, yes, there may be losses. I personally don't want to lose the complex sentence. I think it's a cultural resource, it's a cultural tool which has a significance, but how do we make it, as it were, relevant to young people who don't come across it in their ordinary lives? So, but the other kind of complexity, of course, which is there, is that, and that's one of the really significant points, there is now a new complexity, which is the relation of writing and image, which has got to be understood. Yeah, so whereas the writing has become syntactically less complex, the text is more complex because of the relation between writing and image. Whereas here, I think we assumed that this was merely an illustration of something which has been said in the writing. In this, on this page here, this is not an illustration of what is being said here, but rather this is the core content of the curriculum being expressed in visual terms. Yeah, so something has changed. Writing is now a kind of a peripheral activity. It gives a pedagogic framing to what's going on here. The core content of the curriculum is represented in image. The two have to be related. The images are of different kinds. Here is a kind of a topological representation, a highly abstracted representation of a circuit. Here is a highly abstracted representation of a circuit. Here's a relatively realist representation of a circuit. So it's not the case that you can't be abstract and can't generalize with image, because these two kinds of images are abstract and generalizing. Here is the real, sort of, and here is the highly abstract and, let's say, theoretical. These represent all kinds of other circuits. So two things have happened. Syntactic complexity has lessened, textual complexity has increased. Writing is no longer the central carrier of the information which is relevant here, of the curriculum, but rather images, and the two have to be brought together in a particular kind of relation. So this is how I would kind of see the move from the 1930s to now. And I think that move is not dictated by the appearance of the screen, but it's facilitated by it. The screen is a great facilitator of this move and amplifies that move. So a social move is amplified by the availability of certain kinds of technology. So that's what I wanted to say about the sentence. It's not a definition of a sentence, but it's an attempt to sort of show that the sentence is actually historically and socially shaped by circumstances of a social and a technological kind around it. So then the question that we might all ask, therefore, is what is the purpose of teaching writing? I mean, why are we teaching writing? It's because, you know, the state says you must, or I think it remains part of the purpose of shaping and designing meaning. But it's part of the resource of shaping and designing meaning. That is, I think, the crucial thing. Remember the complex landscape where traditional forms coexist with contemporary forms. In one case, meaning is more shaped by the traditional form. In the other case, meaning is less shaped by the traditional form. And the purpose of teaching writing is really to bring out the potentials of this resource in all the various environments in which young people will meet it now and when they step out into a life of work. The move, I think, which mirrors the social move from the authority of the author to the agency of all the people who come to the text, is a move from the competent performance of something to the interested design. No longer convention says this is how you do it, learn the convention, but rather what is it you want to do, and can we give you the resources and the means of using the resources in relation to what it is that you want to do. That, I think, is a change which underlies at a social level that shift. And I think it's, in terms of disciplinary moves, a move from the linguistic to a semiotic and rhetorical approach. So the question in a rhetorical approach are, what is my interest in communication? With whom am I intending to communicate? What are the central characteristics of my audience? What is it I intend to communicate? What are the resources available to shape my communication? Those are rhetorical questions. Yeah. So what is my interest in all of this? And also, what is the environment of communication in which I'm shaping, designing this entity, this meaning? What resources are available and what resources are apt? You might have lots of resources, but they're not apt for this audience, or they're not apt for that which you wish to communicate. So, for instance, a magnetic field is better communicated by image than by word. And then, therefore, then, what choices are open to me to make? So interest is at the bottom of it. What is it I want to do? Rather than what is it this author instructed me or suggested that I should do? What is it I want to do? What are the resources available? How can I use them in relation to my interests? And just to say it, for me, that isn't a kind of individualistic effort, but rather I am, of course, socially shaped. I'm socially formed. I have a social history. I'm a social person. I use resources which are shaped by my community. I use socially made resources. I use them in a social environment for social purposes. Yeah, but it is my interest, which is different from, say, your interest, even though you also are a person with a social history using these resources in this environment, but you would use them slightly differently. It's an attempt to sort of give acknowledgement to the interest of an individual, even though that individual acts in a social environment with social resources. So that's what I think this shift is about. And of course, there comes then the question of how do we recognize it? How do we change the culture of schooling, but also how do we change the culture of the political environment in order for this to begin to be plausible and effective against a lot of opposition in different places. So here are two examples, and what I want to show here is how a teacher's maybe unawareness or maybe lack of attention to these kinds of issues, a relatively young teacher but an interesting person, a young man, how it makes him not attend to what is actually going on in what the children are doing. So this comes from a 3-year research project which was called The Rhetorics of the Science Classroom. And In the fourth lesson, the teacher says, what I would like you to do, I would like you to prepare a slide. It was about plant cells. I'd like you to prepare a slide, and then put the slide under the on the podium of the microscope and look at it. And when you've done that, working together, 4 people working together, I would like you to draw what you saw and write what you did. Yeah. So they get the onion, they draw out the epidermis, they put it on the glass, they stain it with iodine, put a cover slip on it, put it on the podium. The 4 of them look at it. They talk all the time, of course, while they're doing it, about it. The teacher gives 2 other instructions. He says, I don't want you to use color pencils, and he says, I don't want you to put the illustration at the top, because he's worried that they might make a big drawing and have only room for a little bit of writing. Writing is obviously very important. So here is one of these 4 young people. They're 13-year-olds in a school just behind Euston Station in London, in a city. Here's one of them. Yeah. So here's the drawing. That's what these cells looked like when they were looked at through the microscope. And here is draw what you saw and write what you did. So this person says, at first Amanda and I collected all the equipment. Amanda peeled the skin off the onion while I got the microscope. Amanda put the onion skin on the slide. Then I put a drop of iodine on the onion. Then we put a cover slip on top of it. We then sorted the microscope out, etc. Yeah. Another person, one of the 4, did this. She put the drawing at the bottom. You can see it's a very different kind of drawing. And the teacher's instruction was, draw what you saw and write what you did. She says, step 1, peel off a bit of onion skin and put a drop of iodine on. Step 2, place the onion skin onto a microscope slide and put a cover slip on top. Step 3, put the slide on the microscope and get it into focus. Search for a pattern like a honeycomb. Because in their talk, and then the teacher's previous talk in previous lessons, he actually also mentioned the metaphor of the honeycomb. And one of them said, it doesn't look so much like a honeycomb to me, it looks more like a wavy weave. And this is what she's drawn. Something quite different. She's drawn this air bubble and other air bubbles, which also occur in the other one. But you will agree that they are very different. Yeah? So for a start, I would say, did the teacher recognize where the learning of these children, these 2 young women, is evident? In relation to the drawing, he says, what was the magnification? Can you label any of the parts? That's his comment. And they're good, but make sure you copy up missed work. So not a lot of information from the teacher to the children as to, I see what you're trying to do. And here he says, I'm sorry, this was an overhead transparency which has shown the wear of generations. Diagram needs to be much larger. Did you... I can't read it. But it wasn't a kind of a comment on what she had in terms of content shown. Now my question is, doing science in secondary school at the age of 13 or 14 is of course about attempting to make somebody adopt a scientific habitus, to become scientific. Have these 2 children done that? This person here has not written what they did. She didn't write what you did, but rather she said to herself, to be scientific, you have to show precisely what kinds of actions you need to do so that the experiment can be repeated precisely each time you do it. Yeah, so generically, in terms of genre, she's produced a procedure. This person here said, really, he said, write what you did, and she's done that. Chronologically sequenced, this is what we did. Yeah? To be scientific, you've got to be accurate to the world which you're reporting. Now, why has she produced the drawing that she produced? Well, and why has she produced this kind of drawing? I think this young woman says, to be scientific, you need to represent the world in the drawing as precisely as you can, because that's what scientific accuracy is about. And the other young woman, I think, said, well, I saw on the last handout that the teacher had given us a line down here which said, look at the slide under a microscope, it should look like a brick wall. Each brick is a cell. Yeah, so she selected that out, and she said, this is actually the theory about plant cells. And so, of course, she's produced something which, despite the reality, looks more like what theory is, that which tells you what the otherwise kind of messy world should be like. Yeah, and so she's kind of followed theory. Have they both been scientific? I would say yes. Follow theory, that's what we need to do. Describe what you've done accurately. The other person said, unless we know the procedure strictly, we can't make sure that each time the experiment happens, it's done in the same way. And of course I'll be as precise as I possibly can in drawing the world as I see it. Yeah? In each case, I think both of them are being scientific, using the two modes of image and writing in specific ways, but being differently scientific. I think the teacher hasn't had or hasn't got the means of recognition of what these young people have done. Yeah, so I think neither in terms of their agency, these people have done semiotic work. The semiotic work has produced meaning. What is the meaning they've produced? And in what of these two modes of writing and image have they produced it? He said, draw what you saw, but he really doesn't think much is happening in the drawings. And this is what I think comes out of this for me, that we need to develop tools for the recognition of, on the one hand, agency. What is it people are doing? What does that mean? What does it tell me about the principles which they bring to what they're doing? And on the basis of these principles, what can I kind of do in terms of engaging with them? Not in order to leave them where they are, I'm not saying, fantastic, Amanda, this is fantastic what you've done, but rather to say, this is really interesting what you're doing here. Actually, I think, we can talk about this, and I think I'd like you to go in this direction. Not to leave them where they are, but to attempt to move them on the basis of an understanding of the principles which they brought to the action of engagement with this particular task. So these are just in a written out form. These two, and then a similar kind of example. Again, I suppose in my first example here, it's also from the same research project, but this time it's about blood circulation. My question is, in teacher training, we should focus on getting teachers, intending teachers, to become aware of agency and work, and the significance of it, and the principles which underlie that work, and also the fact that learning will become evident in different ways, and unless we know how to pay attention to these different ways, we won't be able to understand how learning happens, or what learning there has been. So this, I'll just I won't be very long about this, but this is from the same project, as I say, the same teacher, and this time the topic had been blood circulation. And at the end, again, of 4 lessons, he said, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to write a story about a red blood cell going around the body. Yeah? So he's generically non-specific, because after all, the science teacher isn't interested in writing. He's interested in science. He's interested in content. So this person here writes a story in the form of a diary. Dear diary, I've just left the heart. I had to come from the top right chamber of the heart, the right atrium, and squeeze my way through to the right ventricle, where the heartbeat got stronger, and I left the heart. 8 seconds. Dear diary, I'm currently in the lungs. It is terribly cramped in here, as the capillaries are tiny, and there are millions of us. We've just dropped off oxygen, we picked up some carbon dioxide, and so it goes on. Yeah? The diary is sort of okay because it's kind of temporally staged, sequenced. It's like a little bit of a journey. We could ask whether it's the best form, but the teacher hadn't been more specific than write a story. And this young man writes a different kind of story. I won't read it because I can't actually now, but it starts, Blood's Journey. My name is Blood, James Blood. My mission is first, blah, blah, blah. Yeah? So, and here you see one of these monstrous kind of creatures. I think I better get a new slide for this. The teacher's lack of awareness that there are different possibilities of choosing from the general category story, and that these categories, the different generic categories, have consequences epistemologically. Yeah, because if you're James Blood, you need an enemy. And what's going to happen is something about not so much red blood cells around the body, but red blood cells fighting white blood cells. Yeah? Sort of, it gets off in the wrong direction. In other words, a lack of awareness of the representational resources and what they afford and how they will lead you is what the problem is here. Now, he also said the day after that, I'd like you to make a concept map about blood circulation. And here is one of these. There were many different kinds of concept maps. Some had a sort of a flowchart character. Others had 2 kind of central bits. But the point I want to make here is, A, the teacher did not give any instructions. I suspect he would not have known how to give instructions about how to make a concept map. The concept map was a stack of 30 cards, little bits of paper with a term written on. And 2 people worked to make this concept map without instructions. So a total absence of specificity about what these should be. But also the point I want to make, this is a very different representation of what we call knowledge about blood circulation. Yeah, in other words, shifting representation from one mode, the visual, diagrammatic, to the written, in particular kinds of genres, has an effect. Generically, as we saw, narrative is against diary, but also modally, writing is against a diagrammatic representation, has an epistemological effect. These are not the same kinds of knowledge. And I might want to sort of generalize that and say, when you shift from one mode to another, or from one genre to another, what you're never doing is staying with the same knowledge, but you're reshaping knowledge. And so for the science teacher, that would be for me an absolutely crucial function to say, forget about that notion, abstract notion of knowledge about blood circulation. There is no knowledge until it's actually realized in some specific form, modally or generically, or actually modally and generically. And here another example from that very briefly. The woman, different teacher, was about the cell kind of thing too. She said to the class, can somebody tell me something about cells? And Susie says, Miss, a cell has a nucleus. So a verbal, a spoken thing, 2 nominal entities linked by a verb of possession. And then she says, Susie, can you come to the front and draw that? And now, in drawing it, the question that poses itself for Susie is a completely different one, namely, what's a nucleus look like? Is it a dot? Is it a circle? Is it a big dot? Is it in the center? Is it near the edge of the cell, near the cell wall? And so she draws this pretty accurately, I think. But the point is that this is not, as it were, the same knowledge as the knowledge that she had given in speech. And so I think this is where my arguments would be about writing across the curriculum, which some of you mentioned in our sort of going round the room. Writing across the curriculum. Writing is everywhere significant because writing, of course, and other forms of representation are essential in attempting to understand how knowledge becomes realized. I'll not hold myself up over this, but I want to say something else, which is about framing and coherence. It's again from this textbook project. This time the subject is English, 1936, a textbook again for 13-year-olds, and it's Milton's poem L'Allegro. And in this textbook for 13-year-olds, the poem, which is quite a long poem, is represented as a poem. It's simply there as a poem. There are no line numbers, there's nothing else there. It's there as a literary object. In the year 2000, an English textbook for the same age group, now of course not for the 15% who went to grammar school, but for the 100% who are going to be in school, boys and girls. Now, here is a poem, but you can see it's kind of overlaid with pedagogic markings, line numbers, references to other kinds of things here, and then here a kind of a contextualization. It's a poem about the Vietnam War, and a little bit of history, a little bit of factual stuff, a little bit of what was I going to say about this? The word has escaped me. Here a shot from a film, here a photograph from the period. Yeah, it's a framing which is not of a literary object, but of a pedagogic object. Yeah, so in English, over this 70, 80-year period, the literary object has actually disappeared. Poetry is still taught in England, in English classrooms, but poetry is now taught from a very different perspective. What can we say socially about it? What can we say in terms of communication about it? How does this poem make its communicational point? How is it effective? How is it efficient? The other point I want to make about it is a notion of coherence. Again, you've got the two-page spread, which is now familiar, no longer a chapter, but a two-page spread, poem and documentary stuff, filmic stuff, journalistic writing, historical fact, but also a notion of coherence which has changed. And here are two paragraphs which show how the notion of coherence of a text, the integrity of a text, both internally and with its environment, has changed over that period. So this is the paragraph which frames and introduces Milton's poem. The Elizabethan age was succeeded by a period of religious and political strife, which culminated in the triumph of Puritanism under Oliver Cromwell. Therefore, the expansive development of literature was restricted, and thought mainly concentrated on one particular book, the Bible. The dominating figure of this age is John Milton, the great Puritan poet. But he is so supremely an artist that he blends the perfection of an ancient art, as learned from the Renaissance, with the religious turmoil of his time, which has had so profound an effect on his work. His most famous poem is the epic Paradise Lost, which relates the story of man's first disobedience and its fruit. He also wrote many shorter poems, of which the following is an example, and then comes the poem, L'Allegro. Then you have the framing for the poem from the year 2000 in bullet point form. Here you've got a coherent paragraph, sort of hovering between literary discourse and historical discourse, or kind of a new blend of literary historical discourse. Here you've got a kind of a documentary, sort of factual kind of listing. Maybe these are sentences. I don't know whether bullet-pointed things are sentences, or whether a sentence is only a sentence when it occurs in something like this. Yeah, but for me the significant thing is this is a bullet-pointed list, and it's the reader who makes coherence from this. Yeah, here the coherence is pre-given, and here the coherence is left to the reader to establish. So, if, for instance, you were to take this sentence here and put it at the top, nothing significant would change in the list. And you can do that with just about any bullet point here. You can change the order around entirely and nothing happens. Whereas if you change the order here and put his most famous poem is the epic Paradise Lost, which relates the story of man's first disobedience in his fruit at the beginning, you'd have something which is not coherent. Yeah? So here coherence is, it's like the brick wall with each brick kind of cemented in. Here it's something which you are given as a kind of a resource for you to do something with. And coherence, the question of coherence in new forms of text entities is for me a really big issue. So here is the BBC's children's BBC homepage. Is this coherent? Okay, this is not coherent, but would children see it as incoherent? Or would children say, I've got to make this coherent? Or would they not even ask about it? Or would you say that the team that designed this website deliberately made an incoherent website? Would we ever do something which is incoherent? In the other one, the textbook writer had made a coherent paragraph and then a bullet pointed list. I don't think that these people had wanted to make an incoherent website. The fact that there's a bit left over here shows that websites are still kind of relatively young as kind of genres. I tried to make something incoherent. How could we design incoherence? I've just used the resource of font. Yeah. So first of all, we might establish what regularities obtain in the community for which we are designing this incoherent thing, and then we would want to break all of these regularities one by one, or just one or several. Yeah, we establish what social function each of the features has and serves, and then we might say systematically change one feature after another. And we will describe the social effects. Yeah, we can do that as an exercise this afternoon. In other words, what you can do is you could actually attempt to understand what a coherent text is by making something incoherent. But a coherent text is a mirror of a coherent community. Yeah, or rather of somebody who's a member of a coherent community coming to this thing which has a coherence. Yeah, so coherence or incoherence are actually social phenomena in a semiotic guise. I don't know whether that makes sense. But the question whether we can actually design something which is incoherent is quite interesting, because here the first thing that you would do if we did this afternoon, you would say, well, actually, that's quite good. Yeah, because it draws my attention in different ways and blah. We attempt always, as long as something is framed, to impose some kind of coherence on it. Yeah? So depending on what kind of resources you come with and what kind of socialization, that's what happens. This is the BBC's children's website about 5 years later. I think I will leave it at this stage. We have much more time to discuss these things this afternoon, and so leave it there.